book of recaps presents the movie named Passenger. In the vastness of space, the interstellar spaceship Avalon is journeying towards a colony known as Homestead 2. Every room on board is empty as the vessel is guided by autopilot. Its 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers are in a state of hibernation. Unexpectedly, the ship traverses an asteroid belt, which weakens its protective shields. Power is rerouted to reinforce the main shield, but the ship is still on a collision course with a massive asteroid. The inevitable crash results in various system malfunctions. Although the ship initiates self-repairs, one hibernation pod activates prematurely. The occupant of this pod is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer. He awakens to find an automated system assisting him, revealing that he has been in suspended animation for 120 years. Furthermore, he learns that the ship is only 4 months away from reaching Homestead 2. He's assured that during this time, he'll have the opportunity to enjoy the ship's luxurious amenities. Jim receives instructions about his ID band, his cabin, and the primary activities he's expected to participate in before the planet's arrival. Excited and nervous to meet others on the ship, he prepares himself, leaves his cabin, and enters an automated classroom designed for group learning. Feeling a bit anxious, Jim listens as the hologram explains Earth's situation, describing it as overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. Though instructed to save questions for the end, Jim can't help but wonder why he's the only one present. Realizing the hologram can't provide answers, Jim sets out to find other people. Arriving at the main concourse, he finds it deserted, but an automated information desk offers assistance. Requesting to speak with a real person, Jim is directed to find a steward. However, upon reaching the steward's location, he discovers it empty as well. Determined, Jim insists on speaking with the captain. Upon reaching the bridge, despite lacking access to enter, Jim sees that none of the main crew members are awake. Undeterred, he heads to the observatory, where he learns that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2. Realizing he's woken up prematurely, Jim rushes back to the concourse and sends a message to Earth, seeking guidance on how to return to hibernation. The communication system delivers a blow. A response from Earth would take approximately 55 years. Jim is crushed. He wanders around and discovers the ship's bar, where he encounters another person. Something feels off about the bartender, and Jim soon realizes he's an android named Arthur. Unable to comprehend how Arthur is present ahead of schedule, Jim attempts to glean information from him without success. The next day, Jim wakes up in his cabin and heads to the cantina, where he discovers that most menu items are reserved for gold-class passengers only. Disappointed, he settles for a plain coffee and contemplates fixing his hibernation chamber. Gathering the necessary tools, Jim attempts to repair the pod, but to no avail. He then decides to use the tools to access the crew's hibernation chambers. Despite his efforts, Jim's attempts to fix the ship's malfunctions and find solace in various ship activities prove futile. He often finds himself returning to the bar, not just for drinks, but for companionship with Arthur. The android offers advice that convinces Jim to break into one of the gold classrooms and indulge in the ship's luxuries. Jim explores the ship's restaurants, games, and entertainment systems, but the loneliness only intensifies with time. One drunken day, he stumbles upon the hibernation pods and inadvertently finds himself in an airlock with spacesuits for spacewalks. Driven by despair, Jim dons a suit, activates the airlock, and floats into space, captivated by the unparalleled view. The realization that he's the sole conscious human in that moment overwhelms him. Moments later, contemplating ending it all, he hesitates and rushes back inside, only to slip on a bottle in the airlock. Jim rises and is immediately captivated by a woman named Aurora in one of the pods.
Oh my God! Wow!
Intrigued, he locates her in the directory and listens to her passenger interview, feeling drawn to her. Later, he's found seated beside her pod, still engrossed in her interviews. In the bar, Jim immerses himself in Aurora's writings, discussing them with Arthur. He becomes fixated on the irony of his situation, traveling to another planet for a fresh start, waking up prematurely, and discovering his ideal partner, yet she remains unattainable. Jim becomes increasingly fixated on the idea of awakening Aurora, despite initially recognizing the ethical dilemma of potentially stranding her with him on the ship. After deliberating with Arthur, he decides against it, but the notion continues to gnaw at him over time. Eventually, he changes his mind. Steeling himself, Jim activates Aurora's pod, then retreats to his room as she begins to awaken, mirroring his own experience. Later, he nervously ventures to the main concourse, hoping to find her there. To his relief, she is just as bewildered as he was a year prior. Jim explains their situation to Aurora and takes her to the observatory, where he reveals their inability to access the ship's crew or main controls. Overwhelmed, Aurora panics and wants to return to her pod. At the pod, Jim delivers the harsh reality. There's no equipment to help them return to hibernation, essentially stranding them. Returning to the concourse, Jim suggests Aurora rest after her emergence from hibernation. Feeling sympathy for Jim, who has endured over a year alone on the ship, Aurora expresses her compassion towards him. Meanwhile, Jim returns to the bar, grappling with regret over his decision to awaken her. He confides in Arthur, asking the android not to reveal his role in her awakening. The following day, Aurora awakens and heads to the concourse, seeking information about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her, and they decide to have breakfast together. However, as they depart, the automated information desk experiences a malfunction. At the cantina, Aurora notices that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for over a year and insists on getting him a menu from the gold class section, realizing his repetitive routine. They discuss the possibility of repairing the pods, but Aurora, unlike Jim, isn't ready to throw in the towel. She meticulously searches through the infirmary, sifts through research documents, and eventually finds herself at the crew's hibernation quarters, attempting to force open the doors. Meanwhile, Jim notices more malfunctions surfacing throughout the ship. In due time, Aurora expresses her frustrations about life aboard the Avalon. Despite engaging in activities like writing, jogging around the ship, and swimming in the pool, she becomes increasingly aware of their dire situation. Seeking solace, she heads to the cantina to interview Jim, hoping to uncover an intriguing story. When she inquires about his reasons for immigrating to the colony, Jim initially responds with company slogans, but later reveals his aspiration to forge a new life on the new world. Their conversation extends to the observatory, where Aurora finally divulges her own reason for being on the ship. She holds a round-trip ticket. Her plan was to spend a year on Homestead 2 and return to Earth as the first journalist to undertake such a journey, aiming to write the most remarkable story ever told. Despite Aurora's growing resignation about fixing their predicament, Jim finds a way to lift her spirits. Jim takes Aurora on various outings, including dancing, going to the cinema, and playing basketball. Their last stop is the bar to meet Arthur, where Aurora briefly relaxes before their predicament weighs on her mind again. Jim, feeling guilty about his actions, is left alone with the android. In a tender moment, Jim is seen tinkering with something, while in another scene, Aurora discovers a miniature of the Chrysler building he crafted for her in the observatory. Later, they go on a date at the bar, sharing dinner and exchanging stories about their lives. Aurora confides in Jim about her father's passing when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim leads Aurora to the airlock, and they don spacesuits for a spacewalk together. Finally, Jim has someone to share this magnificent experience with. They switch off the magnets on their boots, floating together in space before returning inside, where they share a kiss and retreat to Jim's cabin to sleep together. Soon after, they begin living as a couple, with Aurora moving into Jim's cabin and writing about their life on the ship. They share many activities together, such as jogging, eating, and sleeping side by side. Jim continues to explore the ship and discovers the hydroponics bay, where he surprises Aurora with flowers. One day, as the ship passes by a red giant, they head to the observatory to witness the spectacle. It coincides with Aurora's birthday, so they later celebrate in one of the ship's restaurants, and then at the bar. During the celebration, Jim slips away to the washroom to retrieve a ring he made for Aurora, while she remains in the bar chatting with Arthur. However, Arthur unknowingly reveals Jim's secret, prompting Aurora's shock and anger when Jim returns. In disbelief, she flees in panic, leaving Jim to discover her absence from their cabin. The next day, Jim encounters Aurora in the canteen, but she quickly flees upon hearing him speak. Aurora later confronts Jim in his cabin, expressing her rage through punches and kicks, wanting to inflict harm. Despite her avoidance, Jim tries to communicate with her calmly, apologizing and confessing his love, but Aurora finds it impossible to forgive Jim for his decision to wake her up prematurely. One night, as Jim is in his cabin, another malfunction occurs, leading to a critical error that shuts down the main command of the ship. Later, when he enters the elevator, it malfunctions too. Meanwhile, Aurora discovers that Jim has planted a tree in the main concourse. At the cantina, she encounters a malfunctioning food dispenser. Suddenly, they both hear the voice of the deck chief over the comms, inquiring about the tree. Rushing to the concourse, they find Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. After introductions, they inform the chief about the ongoing malfunctions. He's puzzled by how 3 pods could fail. Taking them to the bridge, Mancuso realizes there's a problem with the ship, but the system data needs to be manually checked. As they leave the bridge, a robot nearly falls on them, prompting Jim and Aurora to report the increasing malfunctions. Mancuso instructs them on data collection procedures, then checks the pods with Jim's assistance. He finds Jim's actions regarding Aurora's pod reprehensible. Later, as Mancuso reviews the collected data at the bridge, Aurora joins him to discuss her pod's malfunction. However, Jim informs her there's nothing he can do about it. When Jim enters with yet another broken robot, Mancuso exhibits signs of hibernation sickness and leaves to rest, but not before coughing up blood. That night, unable to sleep, Aurora decides to go for a swim. Suddenly, gravity is lost throughout the ship, causing Aurora to start drowning as the water from the pool moves with her. As the gravity drive resets, Aurora narrowly escapes with her life. Running into each other, they hurry to find Mancuso. Back at the bridge, the trio begins unraveling the ship's issues. Mancuso realizes a major system failure occurred 2 years prior, creating a ripple effect throughout the ship. Urgently, they must locate and repair the root cause, or risk the entire vessel being stranded. However, Mancuso collapses, prompting Jim and Aurora to rush him to the infirmary. With no available treatments, Mancuso's condition is terminal. Later, in the observatory, Mancuso passes his ID bracelet to Jim, urging them to fix the ship before he passes away. Suddenly, the ship's lights shift to an alarming red, and it begins to tremble. Jim enlists Aurora's help as they dash toward engineering, but another gravity drive failure occurs, followed by another affecting Arthur. Jim deactivates Arthur as they finally reach engineering and begin searching for the problem. They pinpoint it to the power plant, where Aurora accidentally gets sucked in through a breach caused by the asteroid impact. Jim is also pulled in but manages to hold on to the hatch as it closes around him. Eventually, they seal the breach, but Jim realizes there are multiple breaches in the hull. Following the meteor's trajectory, they discover it struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can find replacement parts for it, and they successfully locate and install the part. However, the process of venting the reactor fails repeatedly. Jim realizes they need to manually open the vent door from outside the ship to cool the reactor down. Preparing to go outside, Jim gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, fearing he may not return. As Aurora returns to the reactor, the temperature reaches critical levels. A bolt from the reactor strikes her arm just as Jim approaches the vent from outside. Inside the reactor room, the temperature continues to rise as Jim attempts to bypass the vent door. Realizing he must manually hold the door open, Jim instructs Aurora, despite her reservations. She hesitates, fearing for his safety, but Jim insists they must save the other people on board. Despite their argument, Aurora reluctantly vents the reactor, successfully completing the process. However, the fumes from the reactor push Jim away, breaking his tether and causing his suit's pressure to drop. He informs Aurora of the situation, prompting her to hurriedly retrieve another suit to rescue him. Apologizing once more, Jim awaits her arrival. Aurora dons a suit and flies out to reach him, but her tether falls short. She is pulled back, but manages to grab onto Jim's tether just in time, pulling him towards her. With great effort, Aurora drags Jim into the infirmary, only to discover that he has already passed away. Using Mancuso's bracelet, Aurora overrides the medical protocols and successfully resuscitates Jim using the medical pod. Grateful for his second chance, Jim is forgiven by Aurora. Later, Aurora repairs Arthur, and together they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim takes Aurora to the infirmary and reveals that he has found a way to repurpose the medical pod as a hibernation pod. He encourages her to enter the pod and complete the journey in hibernation. However, Aurora decides to remain awake on the ship with him. In a surprising turn of events, Jim proposes to Aurora, and they spend their lives together on the ship. 88 years later, the Avalon finally arrives at Homestead 2. The awakened crew discovers the ship in an unexpected state. Aurora leaves them a message, recounting the life she and Jim shared aboard the ship while the others were in hibernation. Here's the movie end, and don't forget to join our community and never miss out on the latest content.